You'll never amount to anything. That's what my father said to me the night I packed my bags and left. Not shouted, said. Quietly, almost casually, the way you'd comment on the weather. And I remember standing at the door with one duffel bag and $17 in my pocket, and I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "Watch me." 15 years later, he called me from a number I didn't recognize because I'd blocked the original one, and he needed $50,000. I didn't say yes. I didn't say it with apology. I didn't say it with rage either. I said it the way you close a door you've been meaning to close for a very long time. Slowly, deliberately, and with both hands. Let me tell you how we got there. I grew up in a house where love was rationed. That's the only way I can describe it. There was enough warmth in that home, just not enough for everyone. My older brother Daniel got the lion's share. Daniel, who could do no wrong. Daniel, whose report cards went on the refrigerator while mine went straight into the recycling bin without a glance. Daniel, who got a car for his 16th birthday while I was told to figure out the bus. I'm not saying my parents were monsters. Monsters are easier. Monsters you can point at. What my parents were was something more ordinary and more damaging. People who had quietly decided, maybe without even realizing it, that one child was the investment and the other was the overhead. I was the overhead. And they made that clear in 100 ways that were small enough to dismiss individually and devastating enough to define you collectively. It wasn't just the report cards. It was the way my father watched Daniel's soccer games from the front row and watched mine, the one season I played, the one season I was actually pretty good, from the parking lot through the chain link fence because he said he'd been held up at work. It was the way my mother took Daniel shopping for school clothes every August, like it was an event, a ritual, something to look forward to, and handed me a fixed amount of cash and told me to manage it myself. I was 11. I bought 2 pairs of jeans and a jacket that was one size too big because it was on clearance. And I told myself I preferred shopping alone. I told myself that for years. It was the way they spoke about the future, Daniel's future specifically, what he would do, where he would go, what he would become, and how the future in our house stopped at Daniel's name, as though time itself didn't extend to the second child, as though the second child didn't require a future because the first one had already used the family's share. My mother used to say things like, "Daniel just has a natural gift for these things. Whenever he succeeded at something, I'd also worked hard at." I won second place at a regional science fair when I was 13. I had stayed up 4 nights running to build a working model of a water filtration system. I'd researched it, sourced the parts, documented everything in a notebook I still have somewhere in a box. Second place out of 63 entries. Daniel won first the following year with a project my father had helped him build on weekends in the garage. I could hear them laughing out there, hear the sound of tools and collaboration, while I sat at the kitchen table doing homework alone. You can guess which achievement got the framed photo in the hallway. Mine? She said, "Second place is still very good, honey," and went back to cooking dinner. That was the whole conversation. Second place is still very good. I held on to those words for a long time, the way you press your tongue against a sore tooth, not because it feels good, but because you're checking to see if it still hurts. It always did. There was a summer when I was 15 that I think about sometimes as a kind of summary of everything. Daniel had gotten into a competitive youth business program, the kind that looks good on college applications, the kind that costs a fee to participate. My parents signed the check without discussion. That same summer, I had been accepted into a 2-week writing workshop at the local arts center. I'd applied on my own, written the essay on my own, gathered the 2 teacher recommendations on my own. The program was free. All I needed was bus fare and spending money for 2 weeks. $20, maybe $25. I asked my father once. He said he'd look into it. I asked my mother. She said she'd talk to your father. I never brought it up again. I didn't go to the writing workshop. I stayed home that summer and watched Daniel come back from his program with a certificate and a polo shirt with the program's name embroidered on it. And my parents framed the certificate and put it on the wall next to the science fair photo and talked about it at dinner for a week. I sat at that table every night and ate and said nothing. 15. I was 15 years old, and I had already learned that wanting things was a liability in that house if you were the wrong child. So I stopped asking. I found other ways. I found the library. I found free tutorials. I found workarounds. I became, without meaning to, very good at finding the door that was left open when the front door was locked. It turned out to be the most useful skill I ever developed. But I want to be clear about what it costs to learn it. Nobody should have to learn it that way. I need you to understand something before we go further. I wasn't a troubled kid. I wasn't acting out. I wasn't failing my classes. I wasn't giving my parents reasons to write me off. I was quiet. I worked hard. I stayed out of trouble. I babysat the neighbors' kids on weekends to have spending money of my own. I taught myself to cook because neither parent got home before 7, and Daniel wouldn't touch a pot. I ironed my own school shirts starting at age 12. I was the kind of kid that other adults called so mature and so independent, without understanding that maturity and independence at 12 aren't character traits. They're survival responses. They're what happens when you learn very early that no one is coming. I think that was almost the problem at home. I didn't demand attention, so I didn't get any. Daniel was louder, more confident, more charming. He filled rooms. I sat in corners. And somewhere along the way, my family decided that filling rooms was the only thing worth rewarding. Watch me. That was the promise I made to myself the night I walked out. 2 words. I carried them like a stone in my pocket for 15 years. The night I left was not dramatic, except for those 4 words my father said. There had been an argument. There were always arguments. But this one had finally crossed from ordinary unkindness into something I couldn't recover from. He had told me, in front of my mother, that I was dragging the family down, that I had no direction, that everything they'd given me had been wasted. And I remember looking across the table at my mother, waiting, the way I'd waited my whole life for someone in that house to intervene, to say something, to offer me even the smallest acknowledgement that this was not fair. She looked at her plate. She always looked at her plate. That's the moment I stood up. That's the moment I went to my room, pulled the duffel bag from the top of the closet, and started packing. My father appeared in the doorway and watched me for a moment and said, "You'll never amount to anything." And I picked up the bag and I walked past him and I said, "Watch me." The door behind me didn't even slam. I pulled it closed quietly. I was 18 years old. The apartment I moved into was a single room above a dry cleaning shop on the east side of town. A woman from my school's administrative office had quietly helped me find it. One of those small, almost invisible acts of grace that you only understand the full weight of years later. The rent was $240 a month. The walls were the color of old newspaper. There was a hot plate, a narrow window that looked out at a brick wall, and a radiator that clanged so violently on cold nights that I slept with a pillow over my head. The smell of chemical solvent seeped through the floorboards every morning, and I would lie in bed for a few minutes just breathing it in before I got up, because it was mine. The smell was mine. The cramped ceiling was mine. The secondhand mattress on the floor was mine. For the first time in my life, I was somewhere that belonged to me and to no one else. And even when I was eating instant noodles for the third night in a row, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Something that took me a while to name. It was dignity. Small and battered and barely surviving, but mine. I worked 3 jobs in that first year. Mornings at a coffee shop, 5 to 11, where I learned to move fast and smile at strangers and make exact change without thinking about it. Evenings, stocking shelves at a grocery store, 4 hours on my feet after already being on my feet all morning. Weekends, doing data entry for a small logistics company because I'd taught myself basic spreadsheet skills from free tutorials online. I used the public library's computers, 3 hours at a time, watching the same tutorial videos over and over until I had them memorized. I slept maybe 5 hours a night. I ate whatever was marked down or left over. I wore the same rotation of clothes until they wore out, and then I found replacements at the thrift store on Clement Street, where everything was $2 on Tuesdays. I told almost no one how hard things were, because I couldn't stand the idea of going back. Couldn't stand the idea of proving my father right. You'll never amount to anything. I heard it every morning when the alarm went off at 4:30. I heard it every time my back ached and my eyes burned, and I still had 4 more hours of shelf stocking ahead of me. I heard it when I counted my money out on the kitchen counter on Friday nights and calculated whether I had enough for the next week. I heard it and I used it. I turned it into fuel. It wasn't healthy. I know that now. But it worked. The logistics company noticed me. That's the part that still catches me off guard when I think about it. That simply showing up, simply being reliable and careful and consistent was enough to get noticed. Because that's all I did. I showed up on time. I did what I said I was going to do. I flagged errors I found in the data instead of ignoring them. I asked questions when I didn't understand something, rather than guessing and getting it wrong. My supervisor there, a woman named Carol, pulled me aside after about 8 months and asked if I'd ever thought about operations management. I told her I'd thought about a lot of things. She laughed and said, "Take that as a yes." She didn't have to do what she did next. She wasn't my mentor, wasn't my advisor, didn't owe me anything. But she put me in touch with a colleague who ran a small freight coordination firm and was looking for someone hungry to learn. I was hungry for a lot of things back then. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I will be grateful for Carol for the rest of my life. Not because she handed me something. She didn't. She just pointed at a door I hadn't seen. I'm the one who walked through it. 3 years after I left home, I had a real salary, health insurance, and a 1-bedroom apartment with a door that locked properly and windows that actually opened. I bought a real bed frame. I bought it on a Saturday morning and spent the afternoon building it by myself on the floor of my apartment, following the instructions step by step. And when I was done, I sat on it for a long time, just because I could. 5 years after, I was leading a regional team of 12 people, and I had started quietly saving everything I didn't absolutely need. Not in a savings account, but in index funds I'd spent months reading about, learning the language of, translating from intimidating to manageable. 7 years after, I'd made my first investment in a small commercial property, a storage facility outside the city, based on advice from a mentor I'd met at an industry conference. He was the kind of man who asked sharp questions and then actually waited for the answers. I had never met anyone in a position of authority who genuinely listened to me before. I didn't know how to handle it at first. I overcorrected, talked too much, tried to prove myself before I'd been asked to. He let me run through it and then very gently said, "You don't have to earn the right to be in the room. You're already here." I wrote that down on a folded piece of paper and put it in my wallet. I still have it, creased to almost nothing. That storage facility, 4 years later, tripled in value. I reinvested. I kept going. I kept building. Slowly, quietly, with no one watching but me. The decade between that first job at the freight firm and the phone call from my father is not a montage. I want to be clear about that because stories like mine get flattened into montages all the time. The hardworking kid, the lucky break, the sudden success. And that flattening does a disservice to everyone who is somewhere in the middle of their own version of this story, wondering why it doesn't feel like a montage yet. It didn't feel like a montage. It felt like years. It felt like learning something, getting it wrong, learning it again from a different angle. It felt like a promotion that came with more responsibility than I knew how to hold, and the 6 months of stumbling that preceded me actually holding it. It felt like a relationship I was in for 2 years with a person I genuinely loved but couldn't build anything lasting with, partly because I had no template for what a stable family looked like, and I kept bracing for it to turn into one I recognized. It felt like therapy, actual uncomfortable therapy, with a therapist named Marcus who had a straightforward manner and a habit of asking questions that sat in the room long after the session ended. It was Marcus who helped me name what my childhood had actually done to me, not in a way designed to create a victim narrative, but in a way that helped me understand why certain things cost me more energy than they cost other people, why certain rooms made my chest tight before anyone in them had done anything wrong. That work, the unglamorous, incremental, private work of understanding yourself, is the part nobody frames and puts on a wall. But it is the part that made everything else sustainable. The first property investment was the storage facility, which I've mentioned. What I haven't mentioned is the second, a small mixed-use building, 3 commercial units on the ground floor, 2 residential above, in a neighborhood I'd watched quietly for 2 years before committing. I spent 18 months researching before I signed anything. I read everything I could find, consulted my mentor, ran the numbers until I could run them in my sleep. The day I signed the papers, I drove to the building afterward and sat outside in my car for a while, just looking at it. A woman came out of the ground floor shop, a tailor, I would later learn, who had been there for 11 years and whose lease I honored and eventually extended. And she glanced at my car and went about her day. She had no idea that the person sitting in that car had once been a kid with $17 and a bag and a statement he needed to prove. It felt important somehow, not triumphant, just real, just true, just mine. I drove home and made dinner and went to bed and got up the next morning and kept going. My family, during all of this, nothing. No calls to check in, no curiosity about where I'd landed or whether I was still alive. My mother sent a Christmas card my second year away, which I found touching until I realized she'd addressed it to the wrong name. Not a nickname, not a typo, a different name entirely. A name that belonged to no one in our family that I could identify. I turned it over in my hands for a long time. I think I laughed, actually. The kind of laugh that isn't really a laugh. I was 32 years old when I finally understood, with the kind of clean, lightless clarity that doesn't hurt anymore, that I had not been forgotten by my family. You can't forget someone you never truly saw. I was 32 years old, standing in my kitchen in a real apartment with real furniture I had chosen and paid for myself, holding a Christmas card addressed to someone who wasn't me, and I felt nothing except a faint, wry exhaustion. Not grief, not anger, just the settled recognition that this was who they were and had always been. I set the card on the counter. I made coffee. I went to work. Watch me. Daniel, meanwhile, had taken a different path, or rather had been placed on one with both hands by parents who never once questioned whether the path was sound or whether their son was equipped to walk it. My parents had co-signed a loan for his first business, let him live at home rent-free until he was 27, introduced him to every contact they had, promoted him constantly to their wider family as the entrepreneur son, which I learned secondhand through a cousin who occasionally sent me updates I hadn't asked for, but read anyway. And Daniel was smart. I'll say that clearly because it's true, and because the story doesn't require me to make him stupid. He had real charm, genuine charisma, the kind of energy that made people want to hand him things. What he had never been required to develop was the part that comes after the energy, the follow-through, the grinding patience, the willingness to do the work when no one is watching. The first business folded in 18 months. The second one lasted a little longer, but ended badly, with vendors unpaid and a lawsuit that my parents quietly settled. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he'd burned through most of what my parents had lent him, accumulated significant personal debt he'd never disclosed to them, and was living back at home again, working on what he called his next vision. My parents never stopped believing in that next vision. They funded it with what remained of their savings. And then there was nothing left. I didn't know any of this when my father first called. I had changed my number twice since leaving and lived my life with the comfortable assumption that that chapter was simply closed, that I had written my exit and they had accepted it by their silence, and we had all moved on to our separate futures. So when an unknown number appeared on my phone one evening while I was reviewing contracts at my desk, and I answered it mostly out of habit, and a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade said my name, my actual name, correctly, I felt the past lurch back into the present like a car hitting black ice. He didn't call to say hello. He didn't call to ask how I was, or to acknowledge the years of silence, or to reference the night I left, or to say any of the things that a person says when they've spent 15 years thinking about what they might say to someone they hurt. He called because Daniel's latest venture had collapsed spectacularly, worse than the others, involving debt he'd hidden and investors who were now threatening legal action. And it had taken the last of my parents' savings with it, and they needed help. $50,000. He said the number the same way he used to assign me chores. Flat, direct, as if it were simply the next item on a list and my compliance was a given, as if 15 years hadn't passed, as if those 15 years had been a pause and this was the resumption of normal. I remember the silence on my end of the line. I remember it very clearly. I let it stretch out long enough that he said my name again, uncertain, the authority in his voice thinning at the edges. And in that silence, I thought about the duffel bag. I thought about the chemical smell of that first apartment and the radiator that clanged all night and the $2 thrift store Tuesdays and the 4:30 alarm and the library computer and Carol pointing at a door. I thought about $17 and instant noodles and 5 hours of sleep and a Christmas card with the wrong name. I thought about a 13-year-old kid who stayed up 4 nights to build a water filtration system and won second place and received half a sentence of acknowledgement before his mother went back to cooking dinner. I thought about the Saturday I built my bed frame alone on the floor of my apartment. I thought about the folded piece of paper in my wallet. And then I said, very calmly, I need to think about it. I'll call you back. He said, of course, in a tone that assumed this meant yes. I hung up and sat for a while in my quiet office, looking out the window at the city below. And then I drove home and I thought about it, really thought about it. Not the money, but everything else. What it would mean, what it would cost, not financially. I spent 3 full days thinking about what I actually wanted to do. 3 days. That is more consideration than my family had ever given a single decision that affected me. I called my father back on a Thursday morning from my office. I'd arrived early, made coffee, sat in my chair, looked at the window for a while. I'd worked hard for that window. I thought about it deliberately while the phone rang. He answered on the second ring, which told me he'd been waiting by the phone, which told me he was more scared than he'd sounded. I told him I wasn't going to lend the money. I told him simply, without anger, without the long speech I had actually written out in a notebook and then set aside because I realized it was for my benefit and not the conversation's. I just said it. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're really going to turn your back on your family?" And something in me went absolutely still because I recognized the move immediately. The reframe, the attempt to cast my refusal as the original sin rather than the response to 15 years of his. I took a breath and I said, "I didn't turn my back on anyone, Dad. I left because you told me I'd never amount to anything. And I've spent 15 years proving that wrong. I'm not turning my back on family. I'm just not carrying debt that isn't mine." He was quiet again. Then he said, "We're your parents." I said, "I know." And then I said, "The answer is no." He hung up. I sat with the silence for a moment and then turned back to my work. My mother called the next evening. I almost didn't answer, but I did because I had decided I was going to face this completely and without shortcuts. Her approach was softer, more layered. Not because she was manipulative exactly, but because that was the only emotional language she'd ever learned. She led with love. She told me she'd always believed in me, which landed so far from my lived experience that I had to set the phone down on the desk for a moment and look at the ceiling. She said that families go through hard times. She said that Daniel was struggling, that it wasn't his fault, that he needed support. She said that I, of all people, should understand what it felt like to need support. I noticed the shape of that argument, the implication that I owed my brother grace because I had once needed grace, as though the grace had ever been extended. I let her talk. I've learned the genuine value of letting people finish, of waiting until they've used up all their prepared material, because what comes after the preparation is the truth of what they actually have. When she went quiet, I said, "Mom, I hear you. I love you. And the answer is still no." She cried, not performed crying, real crying, tired and worn and genuinely sad, and I believed every bit of it. It was also the first time she had ever cried specifically over me and not over something I'd failed to be. I'm not proud of how complicated that felt. It didn't change my mind. What came next was the extended family phase, which in retrospect was entirely predictable. Aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to since I was a teenager suddenly had my contact information and strong opinions about what family means and what children owe their parents. One uncle left me a voicemail in which he called me selfish 4 times. I counted. One aunt sent a text that said I had always been the difficult one, which I found almost admirably on the nose. A cousin I had genuinely liked growing up, someone I'd spent summers with, someone whose wedding I'd sent a gift to despite not being invited, sent me a long message about how success changes people and how money was clearly more important to me than blood. I read every message carefully and completely. I responded to none of them. Not because I was being cruel and not because I didn't have answers, but because I understood clearly that none of these people were actually talking to me. They were talking to a role, a function, the family member who could solve the problem if they could just be pressured into it. That was all I had ever been to these people, a function. I had stopped performing it. The messages were less about me than about the disruption my absence caused, and I had no interest in explaining myself to people who had never once asked how I was doing across 15 years of silence. Daniel called once. I'll give him that. I genuinely hadn't expected it. I had thought he would stay behind his parents the way he always had, letting them manage the fallout of his choices, emerging only when things were resolved. But he called, and his voice was different from what I remembered. Quieter, flatter. Something that used to fill a room had gone out of it. He didn't open with a request. He said, "I know you talked to Mom and Dad." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know things weren't fair for you growing up. I know I got more than my share. I've known that for a long time, and I never said anything, and I'm saying it now." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I had ever received from anyone in that family, and it hit me in a place I hadn't expected to still be tender. I didn't cry, but it was close. I stayed on the line for a while, just holding the quiet between us. And then I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Daniel. I really do. That matters to me." He started to speak, and I continued, gently but clearly. "But I'm not in a position to take on this kind of financial exposure. And that's a business decision, not a personal one. I hope things get sorted." He said he understood. I think he actually did. I don't know what happened with the debt or the investors or my parents' retirement. I chose not to follow up, not because I don't care about the outcome, but because I understood that caring about people and funding their choices are 2 entirely different things, and I had a right to separate them. We haven't spoken since. But that call closed quietly rather than slamming, and I have always been grateful for that small mercy. I want to tell you about the 6 months after the calls, because I think it's the part people don't tell you about when they tell stories like this. They tell you about the moment of the refusal, the clean, quiet no. And then they cut to the thriving life, as if the no instantly resolves everything. It doesn't. There's a period after, a strange, hollow stretch, where you've done the right thing and it doesn't yet feel like anything in particular. I went to work, I came home, I exercised and cooked and called friends and went through my routines. And underneath all of it, there was a low-grade hum of something I eventually identified as grief. Not for the family I'd lost, but for the family I'd never had. For the 15-year-old who didn't go to the writing workshop. For the kid whose science fair notebook no one ever asked to see. Grief is not the same as regret, and I want to make that distinction clearly. I would not have done anything differently. But you can make a right decision and still grieve what the situation required. You can close a door firmly and still feel the weight of it afterward. That's not weakness. That's honesty. In the months after, I waited for the feeling to pass. The strange mix of weight and lightness that came from finally, completely, irrevocably closing something that had been half open my whole life. It did pass, slowly, the way weather passes. I started sleeping better. I noticed it first as a small thing. I wasn't grinding my teeth anymore, which a dentist had been noting for years. Then I noticed I was cooking more, taking longer walks, staying in conversations longer than necessary because I was enjoying them rather than managing them. I promoted someone on my team who reminded me a little of myself at 23. Quiet, capable, not quite sure she deserved to be in the room. And I watched her take the responsibility and expand into it. And I felt something I can only describe as continuity. Like something that had been given to me by Carol was being handed forward. Like the chain of small, invisible grace had a link I was now part of. I bought a second property that year, and a third the year after. Not because I needed to prove anything anymore, because I had discovered, somewhere along the way, that I genuinely loved the work, loved the problem solving, the patience, the way that reliable systems reward you quietly over time, the same way I had rewarded reliably, quietly, over time. It turned out I'd been practicing the right skills all along. I just hadn't been in a room that valued them yet. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 18 with a duffel bag and $17. I know that love given conditionally is not really love. It's leverage. I know that leaving a place that diminishes you is not abandonment. It's survival. And survival is not something you should ever apologize for. I know that building something from nothing is not just financially satisfying. It rewires something deep in you, something that was told it was nothing, and proves to it concretely and irrefutably that it was wrong. I know that the people who dismissed you will not always come to you in defeat, but when they do, you are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say no without guilt, without lengthy explanation, without performing the forgiveness they're demanding before they've offered anything resembling accountability. You are allowed to say no calmly and completely, and then go back to your life. That's not coldness. That's what boundaries actually look like when they're real. Not dramatic, not announced, just simply, quietly maintained. I still have the number my father called from. I haven't blocked it. My therapist Marcus once asked me why, and I sat with the question for a long time before answering. I think it's because blocking it would be a performance of closure, and real closure doesn't need an audience. I'm not sure I'm entirely closed. I'm not sure closure is a destination you arrive at and stay in. I think it's more like a direction you keep choosing. I'm not sure why. Maybe because blocking it felt like a gesture, and I'm done making gestures for an audience that isn't there. Keeping it feels like a choice I make every day. Every day I see it in my missed calls, and every day I decide not to call back, and every day that decision belongs entirely to me. That's the part they never gave me. Choice, agency, the dignity of being treated like someone whose inner life was worth asking about. I gave all of that to myself, slowly, across 15 years, one decision and one early morning and one locked door and one folded piece of paper at a time. And no one, not a father with 4 quiet words and a dismissal, not a mother who cried at her plate, not an uncle who left angry voicemails, not an extended family with opinions and no receipts. No one can take that back. If someone told you that you would never amount to anything, I want you to stay with what I'm about to say. They were not seeing you. They were seeing the edges of their own imagination, which was small, and projecting it outward onto you, because that is what frightened people do. They could not picture what you were capable of because they had never pictured it for themselves. Your job is not to prove them wrong for their sake. Your job is to build something so honest, so earned, so completely yours, that the proving happens as a byproduct, something you barely notice because you're too busy living. I barely noticed it. I was too busy showing up, too busy learning, too busy building one floor at a time, too busy becoming someone whose name goes on things. Not frame certificates on someone else's wall. Real things, lasting things, things that exist in the world because I put them there. Watch me. 2 words. That's where it started. 2 words, a duffel bag, $17, and an absolute refusal to be what someone else had decided I was. Watch me. And I did.